January 11th, 1966. Hobo Woods, 20 miles north of Cu Chi, South Vietnam. Corporal Robert Bowtell of the 3rd Field Troop, Royal Australian Engineers, lowered himself into a hole in the jungle floor no wider than a kitchen window. He was 33 years old, married, with 3 children at home and a 4th on the way. He was also over 6 feet tall, a big man built for a different kind of war. Smoke and CS gas had already been pumped into the tunnel ahead of him to force out whoever was hiding inside. Bowtell crawled into the dark to find out what the gas had flushed loose. It found him first. 20 feet in, the tunnel narrowed into a trapdoor between 2 chambers, a passage built for a frame half the width of his shoulders. Bowtell wedged tight. He could not go forward. He could not pull back. Above him, his mates were already digging frantically to reach the shaft. A soldier named Private Jim Daly went in after him, 4 separate times, further than any order allowed, until his own platoon commander physically pulled him back out. Remember Jim Daly? Hold on to what he did in that tunnel, because it matters later, and it says something about this war that no medal citation ever quite captured. By the time anyone reached Bowtell, the gas meant to drive an enemy into the open had done something else instead. He had dislodged his own respirator fighting to get free, and the tear gas and the dead air did the rest. He was not killed by a bullet, a mine, or an ambush. He was killed by a hole in the ground, 30 inches wide, that had never once been built with a man like him in mind. Remember that number. 30 inches. Hold on to it, because for the next 7 years, the most powerful military machine on Earth kept running into that number, in one form or another, and kept losing to it. If this story is showing you something about this war you haven't seen before, a like genuinely helps it find people who care about getting the details right. By 1965, American commanders in South Vietnam believed they understood exactly what they were fighting. The doctrine was called search and destroy, and it rested on an assumption that had held true in every major war the United States had fought since 1917. Find the enemy. Mass superior firepower against him. Kill him faster than he can be replaced. It had worked in the Argonne, in Normandy, in Korea. By the height of the war, more than 500,000 American troops were stationed in South Vietnam, backed by artillery, helicopters, and the largest air force ever assembled in the history of warfare. In Vietnam, the arithmetic looked even more lopsided. American air power owned the sky completely. A single B-52 strike could drop more explosive tonnage on a target than an entire division of field guns firing for a full day. Against an enemy without an air force, without armor, without anything resembling the industrial machine of the United States, this should have been decisive within months, not years. What the Americans did not yet understand, in the villages of Cu Chi District and the jungle the maps labeled the Iron Triangle, was that the enemy had already solved the problem of American firepower. They had solved it years before the first Marines ever waded ashore at Da Nang. Vietnamese fighters had begun digging beneath these villages in the late 1940s, resisting the French, hollowing out perhaps 30 miles of tunnel by hand with hose and rice baskets. When the French left and the Americans arrived, the Viet Cong inherited that network and did something no guerrilla army had attempted at this scale before. Between 1960 and 1965, they expanded it to more than 120 miles, in places 3 levels deep, the lowest galleries running over 30 feet beneath the surface. By the time the U.S. 25th Infantry Division built a base camp outside Cu Chi Town in 1966, American soldiers were sleeping, eating, and standing guard directly above a tunnel network they did not know existed. Here is the detail that mattered more than any weapon either side carried into this war. The tunnels of Cu Chi were not bunkers, and they were not simple holes for hiding. They were an underground country, with kitchens, hospitals, weapons workshops, sleeping galleries, meeting halls, and command posts built to move thousands of fighters within walking distance of Saigon and keep every one of them completely invisible. And when American troops found an entrance and tried the obvious solution, pump in gas, pour in water, drop in a grenade, the tunnels simply refused to cooperate. Trapdoors sealed sections off from each other. Some galleries could be flooded on command to drown out an intruder and then pumped dry again later. A 750-pound bomb landing 50 yards from an entrance did nothing to the tunnel or the men inside it. The Americans were not failing to find the enemy. They were failing to understand what they had found. The tunnels beat American firepower using an idea so simple it barely sounds like engineering at all. Every chamber, every connecting shaft, every trapdoor between one gallery and the next was cut to fit the body of the person who dug it. Vietnamese soldiers and villagers, most of them slight, most of them well under 5.5 feet tall, could move through passages 60 to 80 centimeters wide and just over a meter high without slowing down. An American or Australian soldier, 40, 60, 80 pounds heavier and half a foot taller, could not. Kitchens were vented through shafts that could run 1,000 feet from the fire itself. The smoke bled off gradually through multiple hidden vents disguised as termite mounds. Nothing rising from the jungle floor ever pointed back to the men eating below it. Nothing gave them away. Every tunnel zigzagged, so that no straight line of sight, no straight line of fire, and no straight line of gas could travel more than a few feet before hitting a bend. No two sections of the network were laid out the same way, which meant no map drawn from one discovery told you anything reliable about the tunnel a mile away. Entrances were cut no larger than a sheet of paper, hidden under leaf litter, invisible from 3 feet away. Above ground, the approaches were seeded with punji traps, sharpened bamboo built to maim rather than kill, because a wounded soldier cost the Americans 2 more men to carry him out and a helicopter to fly him away. Salvaged American shells that had failed to detonate were dug up, defused, and rebuilt into the very mines waiting for the next patrol. Every ventilation shaft along the network was also cut at a shallow, angled slant rather than straight down, so that floodwater poured in from above would run off sideways instead of drowning the men living beneath it. American handlers brought German shepherds trained to smell for the sweat and skin oil no human body can wash away completely. And for a while the dogs worked. Then Viet Cong fighters began leaving scraps of captured American uniforms, bars of American soap, and bottles of American aftershave near the air holes, so a dog trained to alert on the enemy instead smelled home. Within months, several American units quietly stood their dog teams down. The dogs went home. The tunnels stayed. This was not a hiding place that happened to be cramped. The cramped was the design. Every dimension of that tunnel had been chosen, deliberately, to let one kind of body through and refuse another. And on January 11th, 1966, it refused Robert Bowtell. The men who eventually went down into tunnels like this one called themselves tunnel rats, with the particular dark humor soldiers reserve for the worst jobs. They even adopted an unofficial motto in dog Latin. It translates loosely to not worth a rat's hindquarters. They carried a revolver instead of a rifle, because a rifle could not be aimed one-handed while the other hand held a flashlight. Many gave up cigarettes, gum, and even their own scented soap, because in total darkness, smell was sometimes the only warning a man had left before something in the black reached out and touched him first. Bowtell's death came 4 days into Operation Crimp, the first serious American attempt to break the tunnel system open. 8,000 troops from the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and Bowtell's own 1st Battalion. Royal Australian Regiment swept the Hobo Woods after B-52s dropped 30-ton bomb loads across the jungle canopy. What the infantry found on the ground, almost by accident, was the concealed headquarters of an entire Viet Cong military region. Nobody wanted to go down and confirm it. The tunnels were narrow, unmapped, and almost certainly still occupied. So the job fell to a handful of Australian combat engineers from the 3rd Field Troop, men with no training for underground warfare, who volunteered anyway, arming themselves with nothing more than a torch and a bayonet. Their commander, Captain Alexander McGregor, had his men carry lengths of field telephone cable into the dark, paying it out behind them as they crawled. It was slow work, but for the first time, someone above ground could sketch a rough shape of what lay beneath their boots. Remember that cable. It was the beginning of the only weapon that ever actually worked against this network. Patience, measured in feet of copper wire. For 4 days, the engineers crawled through darkness that swallowed sound, hauling out radios, medical supplies, weapons, and enough documents to fill 8 trucks. And on the 4th day, Corporal Bowtell went down to help clear a section that had already been gassed. The tunnel that was built to exclude an enemy his size did exactly what it was built to do. Pay attention to what that means, because it is the whole shape of this war compressed into a single afternoon. Bowtell was not undone by a booby trap the Viet Cong had built to kill him specifically. He was undone by ordinary construction, the same trapdoor a Vietnamese fighter had passed through 100 times without thinking about it. The war he was fighting had been engineered, from its very first shovel of clay, around a body that was not his. His wife, Josephine, was 5 months pregnant with their 4th child when he died. He was buried with full military honors at Tarandak Cemetery in Malaysia, thousands of miles from the home he did not live to return to. A year later, the Americans came back with a much bigger hammer. Operation Cedar Falls, launched in January of 1967, put 30,000 troops into the Iron Triangle, the largest ground operation the United States had mounted in the war so far. The entire village of Ben Suc was emptied at gunpoint and its buildings leveled, on the theory that a population could not shelter a network it no longer lived above. Bulldozers scraped away jungle canopy that had hidden tunnel entrances for 2 decades. Tunnel rats from the 25th Infantry Division went down into galleries the size of the crawlspace that had killed Bowtell, and came back up with something extraordinary. 500,000 pages of Viet Cong military documents. Maps of American base camps. Lists of informants operating inside Saigon itself. Detailed plans for an assassination attempt on Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara during a scheduled visit to the country. By every measure available to the men writing the after-action reports, Cedar Falls was a triumph. The underground command structure of an entire province had been opened to daylight for the first time in the war. Here is what those reports could not yet see. The tunnels underneath the Iron Triangle had not been destroyed. They had been searched, some of them collapsed, some of them finally mapped, and then, because no army can occupy every hole in the ground in a country the size of a war, abandoned. Within months, Viet Cong units filtered back through unmapped side galleries the Americans had never found. The network still reached almost to the edge of the capital itself, beneath the bulldozed clearings and the burned village of Ben Suc. On the night of January 30th, 1968, that same network helped stage one of the opening blows of the Tet Offensive, a coordinated assault against dozens of cities and installations across South Vietnam. Including targets in Saigon, barely a day's walk from tunnels the Americans believed they had already conquered twice. Viet Cong fighters who had spent the previous 18 months living, cooking, and healing their wounded 30 feet under the Iron Triangle came up out of the ground within sight of the American embassy. The war was supposed to be almost over. It was not. Television cameras carried the footage home within hours. For the first time, the American public watched an enemy that Washington had called beaten stage an attack in the heart of the capital his commanders had promised was secure. The tunnels had not just supplied a battle. They had quietly funded a shift in how an entire country understood the war it was fighting. The tunnels of Cu Chi were never actually beaten. They were bombed, gassed, bulldozed, and mapped in pieces, and every time, they simply closed back around the wound like water around a stone. By 1969, once American bombers were freed from targets in North Vietnam, B-52s began what soldiers called carpet bombing across the Iron Triangle. Square miles of jungle turned into a cratered moonscape still visible from the air today. Sections of the tunnels did finally collapse under that weight. Most of the network did not. This is the second reveal, and it changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The United States did not lose the fight for the tunnels because its weapons were too weak or its soldiers were not brave enough. Robert Bowtell proved the opposite of that on the day he died. So did Private Jim Daly, who went back into that collapsing shaft 4 times to bring his friend out. So did Captain McGregor's engineers, who kept feeding copper wire into the dark long after every reasonable man would have stopped. Courage was never the problem. Firepower was never the problem. The problem was that the United States was fighting a war shaped like a country. Armies, air wings, aircraft carriers, all of it built to project power across oceans. The enemy had shrunk its entire war down to the width of a human shoulder and buried it where none of that power could reach. You cannot carpet bomb a measurement. You cannot call in artillery on 30 inches of clay. A B-52 can flatten a forest, but it cannot make a tunnel wider, and it cannot make an American shoulder narrower. Somewhere underneath the free fire zones and the defoliated tree lines, an idea had been dug into the ground years before the first American combat troops ever set foot in Vietnam. The idea was simple. If the enemy's strength is his ability to reach you, build something his strength cannot fit inside. Every technological advantage the United States brought to this war was built to close distance, faster aircraft, longer range guns, heavier bombs. The tunnels of Cu Chi answered all of it with the opposite instinct. Instead of closing distance, they made distance irrelevant by ensuring that the war's most important ground could never be reached at all, no matter how close an army stood above it. Somewhere between 40 and 45,000 Vietnamese men and women died defending this network over the course of the war. Most of them were never named in any American after-action report. Most of them were buried in ground they had already spent years living beneath. The tunnels did not win for free. They simply won. The tunnels of Cu Chi are still there today. Portions of the network have been preserved, and the sections tourists crawl through now have been quietly widened, some of them nearly doubled, so that visitors built on Western frames can pass through them without getting stuck. It is a small, almost accidental correction to the thing that killed Corporal Bowtell in the dark on the 11th of January, 1966. The tunnel that took his life was never rebuilt for a man his size. It simply stopped needing to matter. 4 months after Robert Bowtell died wedged in a tunnel he was never meant to fit through, Josephine gave birth to their 4th child, a son. They named him Robert, after the father he would never meet. Thank you for spending this time with this story. If it reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find people who care about getting this history right. If you're not subscribed, I'd be glad to have you here, and the bell means you won't miss the next one. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if someone in your family served in Vietnam, on any side of that war, tell us about them in the comments. Their stories deserve to be remembered too.